disrupt that pipeline. Let's get up to speed with the Nord Stream story before I bring yet another Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist into your life. Here's the news. No, here's the effing news. Have a look at this.
You know what they'll tell you on the mainstream media? Russia blew up their own pipeline in an act of inconceivable, senseless, unprofitable self-destruction. Certainly wasn't America doing it. There are no clues or evidence to suggest that America did it. Today's story is fantastic. The evolution on the Nord Stream pipeline story is a piece of reporting from a very credible Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who, get ready, is about to be called a conspiracy theorist, a whack job, and condemned for whatever they can find. Is he old? Oh, yeah, he's old. That's bad, though, isn't it? Well, is it? Yes, because he said something that's inconvenient. Yeah, old is bad. The bombing of the Nord Stream underwater gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea was a covert operation ordered by the White House and carried out by the CIA, a report by a veteran investigative journalist claims. And we all knew that anyway, because it was bloody obvious. Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, has claimed that US deep-sea divers using a NATO military exercise as a cover planted mines along the pipelines that were later detonated remotely, as Jocko Willink said when he was on our show about 3 months ago. Once hailed the greatest American investigative reporter, Hersh, 85, who broke stories such as the mass murder of 500 civilians at My Lai in Vietnam and the torture of prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, said that the Black Op was ordered by President Biden and that the attack was carried out by the CIA in cooperation with Norway. Many of us were discussing this possibility just because it seemed plausible, just because it had been explicitly stated that the US had an agenda to take over trade of natural gas between Russia and Europe, that they saw that as a market that they should own, because Joe Biden in public said, well, I tell you, we'll blow up that pipeline. Just because Condoleezza Rice about 20 years ago explicitly said,
you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence. You want to depend more on the North American energy platform, the tremendous bounty of oil and gas that we're finding in North America. You want to have pipelines that don't go through Ukraine and Russia. For years, we've tried to get the Europeans to be interested in different pipeline routes. It's time to do that.
I suppose it wouldn't be a big deal were it not for the fact that the whole thing is framed by a war that we're continually told is humanitarian, when every day new evidence emerges that it is financially motivated, that Zelensky and his government have unusual financial relationships, that Ukraine is corrupt, that it was okay to say Ukraine was corrupt before the start of this war. Peace deals have been suggested and then sabotaged until it's convenient and enough profit's been extracted. It just goes on and on and on until in the end you think, well, what is it we're being told right now that's not true? Because we could start just adjusting a bit more quickly. Here's a few guesses for me. We're going to find out more stuff about the pandemic. They're going to use new ways of introducing lockdowns and digital IDs and surveillance, and they're going to agitate for a war with China. Those are just some of my guesses. Let me know your own conspiracy theorist that will just be normal news in a few months in the comments and chat below. And as for this Seymour Hersh, that conspiracy theorist with his crackpot stories about the mass murder of 500 civilians in My Lai. Oh yeah, the Vietnam War. Of course now we all know that was an ethical, necessary war. There wasn't a mad, giddy proxy war carried out by lunatic, corrupt presidents and unnecessarily draining American lives and resources and wasting the life of the good people of Vietnam. And what about this Abu Ghraib prison? Oh, what a lot of hocus pocus that turned out. It's all well and good complaining about conditions in Abu Ghraib, but may I ask, how are we to reform these Iraqis if we don't attach electrodes to their genitals? So Seymour Hersh, with these crazy stories about Vietnam and Abu Ghraib, is just some sort of nutcase. He should have his own channel on Rumble.
We are joined now. Are we queuing me? Because I didn't get one. Thank you. We're joined now by Seymour Hersh, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who already would have seen the ineptitude of that link and probably been astonished by the standards and how they've fallen in media in the last 10 or 20 years. We are speaking to Seymour Hersh because of his recent Substack article on the US involvement in the Nord Stream pipeline, which of course suggests that the US involvement was contrary to their very public denial, and even why the denial itself was significant in avoiding congressional permission. It's a fantastic piece of writing from a prize-winning journalist. It's an honor to have you, Seymour. Thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here, I think. Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
What's your hat?
It's probably attention-seeking on some level, Seymour. I've come from the world of entertainment, probably haven't entirely let go of the idea that I'm a sort of a physical representation of the radical stance that I take in my own journalism, one journalist to another.
I don't know if the word radical is the right one, but we'll let that one stand.
You want me to take the hat off, because I'll do it out of respect for you and your prize.
I don't want to see what's there, but I will tell you something. I was fascinated, as I told one of your aides just a minute ago, by the Condoleezza Rice quote, and my pay for this performance here will be. Somebody send me a link to that.
We will send that to you.
It's not. It's. You're ahead of the curve with that idea, but that's been a prominent theme in the American conversations about oil. And it is a fact that Norway, which did help us, has more than doubled the amount of oil, natural gas rather, is shipping now to Western Europe. It had about 9 or 10%. It's way up. And so you can never cut out mercantile interests. But there were probably much more immediate interests, the war in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a fascinating point that you were making. Anyway, so I got something out of this, so I'm happy.
Look, can you stop being so generally cynical about my hat and the entire experience of this interview? I got something out of it. You don't need to overplay I'm a well-worn journalist, I was around during Watergate, I've got a Pulitzer Prize. I get it. You're senior, you're world-weary, you've become cynical about establishment power.
No. It's much more ephemeral than that. It's just, it's amusing. The hat is amusing. I don't think there's anything profound in me talking about it. It's what I see.
Sir, firstly, I will credit Gareth, who makes the show with me, for his research that led to our use of the Condoleezza Rice clip. And our general approach is to challenge the dominant narrative that we are given through mainstream media, which once was the domain of ordinary investigative media, which seems to have become deeply sanitized in the last 20, 30 years. Increasingly, we're seeing, whether it's Chris Hedges or Glenn Greenwald or yourself, journalists that have been prized for their investigative work being, if not demonized, certainly subject to something amounting to smears. The White House has already denied your story, and I'd like to ask you what you think has happened to journalism in the last 20 or 30 years, and why we are not presented with complex narratives that undergird reporting with the kind of economic, financial, military and geopolitical interests that usually lead to events like the Ukraine-Russia conflict, or indeed an event, sort of broadly speaking, within the remit of that narrative, like the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage.
Well, I think one of the problems, look, you're asking, you're throwing the ball to me. This is all I brood about a lot, because I worked at the New York Times in the 70s. And had a great time, was never sort of blocked from writing stuff. And it's a different world now. Oh, come on, stop it. But anyway, the bottom line is that I think what a secret source now is for the people, many of the people who write for the major newspapers, is a press secretary who, says, come over here, I'll tell you something a little different than I've told the other guys. I just don't understand why they're not jumping on certain stories. Certainly this story is, I could just tell you, a friend of mine, I have a wonderful old friend who escaped from the Middle East, became an oil man, became very rich and very happy, living in France now. He wrote me after the story, and he said, oh, Sai, he said, my nickname, he said, you have become a master in the deconstruction of the obvious. I mean, what was so hard about this story? We know Russia didn't do it, because if they wanted to, they could turn a valve. And so I guess, is Macedonia a member of the NATO? Maybe they did it. Where do you go for the next possible suspect? Who is it? It's purely us, since the president basically said it. But the bigger question is, what's going on with journalism? I don't know. My old newspaper, the New York Times, for which I did all sorts of stuff on the CIA and Watergate and Vietnam for them, hasn't touched the story. Neither has the Washington Post, which is the two great main sheets. I don't think the Wall Street Journal has. The rest of the country, some people have. It's just like a blank. It's like, it could be It's simple as this. We're coming off the Trump years, and we made big divisions in the media. We're either going to be for or against Trump. It could be the same sort of dichotomy plays out. We're now in the Trump corner. And if we write something critical of we're now in the Biden corner, rather. If we publish something critical of Biden, we might be leading ourselves open to more Republicans. The guy in Florida, et cetera, DeSantis. I don't know what the fear is, but it can't just be about the fact that I don't name sources. I spent 9 years at the New York Times writing about the CIA going after Allende and going and all that stuff, killing people abroad without naming sources. I mean, either trust what I do or you don't.
Yes. I know that you also wrote about Abu Ghraib, significant revelations there, and about the mass murders in Vietnam of civilians. And the banalization of the media space is a theme that we touch upon frequently, the infantilization of us as the audience class. Even with the current escalation of tensions between the USA and China through the sanctions around semiconductors, and of course the rather more visually stimulating and sensational story that accompanies the balloon and indeed the shooting down of the balloon.
Can I tell you about the balloons? Can I tell you a little bit about the balloons?
Yeah.
I asked somebody about it. I have friends, and I said, well, "What's going on with the balloons?" Of course, they've been there forever. Maybe you could argue they could take photographs of what a satellite can see much better. But basically, the last wave, the unnamed car-like with an American press so full of it, it turns out there's the federal government has a contract with the meteorology department or whatever it is, weather department at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and that is one cold place. It's way up there. Also, most of the classes are underground. You go underground to classes. I've spoken there. I know about this firsthand. And over the Arctic Circle everybody flies the polar route from Asia to America, and there's no weather station there. So the university has these little vehicles that goes and reports. Pilots want to know if there's any unusual weather going on. That's what you have to do. And they are reporters of that information. And that's what was shot down. One of those things was shot down was one of those units that is sent up by a university paid by the government to go over the Arctic Circle and report on, in case there's an extreme wind, I don't know what the cliche is when the wind goes down in a downdraft, and since there's no official station there, who wants to be there to run a weather station? And so they're basically a remote weather station. That's what they shot down. Whether they're going to talk about it in the next couple of weeks, and we put about actually, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars into a new fighter, the F-22, that's coming online. We had one called the F-1. We put $203 billion in to make about 100 of them. About in the 80s, so far 7 exist. It's just money just floats. But we paid a lot of money for the F-22, and its first kill was the first balloon. That one was discovered over Montana, and the pilot, and I'd like to think that he knows exactly what he's doing. When he landed, in World War II, your guys and your Spitfires and us and our P-51s, you took care of every Messerschmitt. You painted on the side a decal for the kills. We did the same in Asia when our P-51s. So the pilot of this F-22 getting the first kill of this plane painted a balloon on the side of his fuselage. I'd love to think he was joking. I don't know that. I know he did it. I don't know what was in the state of mind. But that's what we're reduced now. We've got a kill. We killed a balloon, and that's worth a couple, few $100 billion for a plane.
Yeah, a small price to pay for dispatching some hydrogen and some helium.
It's over the top. It's over the top crazy. That's all I can tell you.
How do you feel then about the context that has to be said frames the Nord Stream pipeline story, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the years of infringement upon former Soviet territories, the 2014...
You're not allowed to say that. How dare you say that there might have been reason behind, the language used, it was done in 1990, the first agreement not to go east, when East Germany joined West Germany that was in NATO. We wanted to make the combined country. And don't forget, the Germans had a real problem because after World War II, when they wanted to get back into civilization and be accepted by other countries, get in the international groups like NATO, they spent a long time murdering people in Western Europe and bombing it and destroying it. And so Willy Brandt was the guy that said, we're going to be a money bank for you guys. We're going to Ostpolitik. We're going to be great neighbors. We're going to trade with you. We're going to show you we belong. Willy Brandt did do that. He got that started for all of his faults. And so in 1990, when they joined, Gorbachev agreed to let this unified Germany into NATO. And the price was a commitment by us in writing that I live in Washington, so I know people. I have a friend that has access to the classified part of the embassy, our embassy in Bonn. And he went and read the cables for me. There's nothing fantastic about it. The language used by our Secretary of State, James Baker, was the equivalent in the documents. The agreement we made with the Gorbachev, it wasn't a treaty, but it was an understanding, not 1 inch. We will not go 1 inch east. And then NATO initially was 19 when it was set up in 49 rather. It's now what, about 170 countries, Macedonia, stuff like that. I'm exaggerating. Well, NATO is a far cry from it's not Europe anymore. It's all over. I don't know. Maybe one of the tropical islands in the South Pacific will become a member of NATO next. And so here's the Russians eating this. Here's Putin eating this. And then we start putting missiles on the border in Poland that we claim are defensive, but in a half a day, it can be turned into offensive weapons. There's no question about that. It's a fact that can be just diverted. It'll take some time, a half a day, but you can fire your 7 minutes from Moscow. And that's another reality. So it's what I hate to see in the paper, in my newspaper, for example, they keep on describing the Russian attack as being without provocation, unprovoked. Well, it was really provoked. I'm very troubled by my president and his immediate foreign national security team, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Victoria Nuland, whose husband is one of the leading neocons who got us helped convince Dick Cheney to go into that the solution to 9/11 and Al Qaeda was to attack Iraq. One of the great non-existence relation. I mean, just so crazy. But anyway, those three, I call them Winkin, Blinken, and Not. I don't know if you have that child story there, but we have it in our country. The first thing they do is they meet in the Secretary of State in Alaska with the Chinese and start telling the Chinese what to do about their own domestic problems. And now we push the war. I don't know things, but I know things. The initial agreement, the initial decision to plan for the pipeline was an option for leverage for the president against Putin. It was started a year ago, 13 months ago in December, and it bled over to early this year. And the idea was to ask the community for ideas. I wrote about this, whether kinetic or non-kinetic, and the word was kinetic. That means we're going to hurt somebody. And so, of course, it emerged, we're going to take out the pipelines. We've been complaining about the pipelines for a dozen years. The first one, Nord Stream 1, and the new one. The new pipeline is interesting because the first one was cut off by Russia. The second one was cut off by the Germans. They put a sanction on it. So Germany always had the option of opening up the pipeline anytime it wanted. And who cares about the pipeline in summer? But comes fall, comes winter, and that's when you're going to need it. The Russian gas natural gas has been supplying Germany and Western Europe with cheap gas for a dozen years, and the economy's boomed based on cheap gas. Now Europe's suffering. It's getting cold. They had a mild winter, but it's getting very cold now. The leading companies are all getting, the price of gas is going up enormously. Companies like BASF, which is the largest chemical company in Germany in the world, has been talking to China about maybe moving some assets there. The consequences of knocking out the pipeline economically are disastrous. As you said, Norway's getting more gas, and Norway was a big player in us with the project. But the key thing is when the president told the intelligence community, I want to see if I have an option. I think the thought of, in my understanding, was the thought of the community was, we're going to do what we do what the president wants. That's the whole idea of having a CIA. I mean, if you're the president of the United States right now, this guy can't get a thing through Congress. But tomorrow, if he wants to, he can take a walk in the Rose Garden with the CIA director, and somebody can get hurt the next day. That makes you feel pretty good, particularly if you can't have your way anywhere else. And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think the CIA is a very dangerous community, but full of a lot of smart people. Anyway, it was always to be an option. And what happened is, he didn't exercise it. They were going to do it at one point when they had cover in the summer. They had cover because of there was a big. The Baltic Sea is not there's no oil there, and the idea of having a bunch of deep sea divers start digging around would have been exposed any problem, any thought of getting away with taking out the pipelines. It just would have been too obvious, too seen. But there was an exercise, NATO exercise last summer. There's been one every summer for 22 years now in the Baltic, and then maybe you could slide it in then. That was the idea. But the president didn't pull a whistle then. In late September, he did it. And by that time, the community itself had thought there was no reason to do it anymore. You know, it was there as a potential threat, but he'd already started the war. And by September, the one thing that was interesting, I've always been among a group of journalists and people in the community have been very skeptical about the chances of Ukraine to win a war against Russia. You know, if you know the history, when in Stalingrad, when the Germans got their great defeat, the Russians were losing 2,400 dead and wounded every 4 hours in the final days of the battle, and one just kept on going. I mean, they are tough. So far in the war against Ukraine, I'm sure in the beginning it's correct that Putin or his generals underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainians to commit hara-kiri, as they have been. But by September, it was clear there was real trouble. Among other things, the corruption was so wild among the top, even including Zelensky. They're all fighting for what percentage of the money they're going to steal. There's a lot of fighting and brooding about that, even today. And so it was a corrupt regime. It never was going to be accepted in the NATO, and it wasn't going to win the war. And so Joe, then in late September, wants to hit, and he gets it. And at that point, I think that there were people in the intelligence community who thought it was, at that point, that didn't make sense. That was just crazy. And what's he doing? He's throwing in, for whatever he can. The fear he had was that since Germany controlled the new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, the one that was just built and was just stopped, they just finished it in 2020. And it was full of gas even then. The gas that came up it's a 750-mile pipeline from Germany all the way to near St. Petersburg right up near Estonia, the border with Russia and Estonia. So the long pipeline was full of methane gas. That's what the gas is, methane. And anyway, and that's what bubbled up. It wasn't pumping any. It just stored there. It would have been perfectly safe. And so I guess that the Biden's thought was, I want to keep any possibility that the Germans and the rest of the Western Union which is going to start getting cold. He did it in late September. Will open up the pipeline and then be at the mercy of Russia. In other words, the way they put it, that pipeline, the Russian gas, was a weapon for the Russians. A weapon, and once you took away that weapon, West Germany, if West Germany cannot open up the pipeline anymore, and Germany rather, and the European allies of NATO, well, then they'll keep on supporting us in the war. They won't have the option of saying we quit. We'd rather have Russian gas than join you in a war that you can't win. And that's what I think the dominant thinking was.
Yes, I think you're right that the US were incentivized by the suggestion that it created the opportunity and necessity, in fact, for harmony between Russia and Europe. It created conditions that were not advantageous, that meant that solutions became evident and suggestible. It was interesting that you touched upon Ukrainian corruption and the current clear out that Zelensky enacted, even though in reporting from The Guardian prior to this conflict, of course, when The Guardian's perspective on Ukraine was radically different and much less simplistic and reductive, they talked about Zelensky's ownership or previous ownership of offshore assets. We know that the oligarch who's recently been ousted, who funded Zelensky's entire career, I understand it, did have a relationship with Hunter Biden, you know, through his corporation Burisma that was paying Hunter Biden. It's fascinating, Seymour, to speak with you with your evident experience and cruel sarcasm when it comes to sartorial matters and hats in particular, to learn that these patterns appear to be increasing and exacerbating over time. That a short time ago you could rely on an organization like the New York Times for anti-establishment radical reporting, and now they are a mouthpiece of the establishment. It's interesting that the Ukrainian conflict, you know, much of the aid that's being offered to Ukraine passes from the Pentagon through the military-industrial complex. Many of those weapons and assets appear to be quite difficult to track, and in the subsequent post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, BlackRock are handling that, and there is an aim for 100% digitalization of Ukraine. So it seems to be a nexus of a great many stories that coalesce around corruption and globalism. A lot of people, by the way, I will tell you, Seymour, on our online chat, adore you and your casual radicalism, although there's a lot of people saying you should not have said that about my hat. I think you've had a bit of a better time than you thought you would have. I think you've enjoyed this a little bit, haven't you? You started off a little bit curmudgeonly in your favourite chair that only you're allowed to sit in, but over time you've warmed to us, as if being warmed by beautiful Nord Stream gas, the only gas you can trust.
Your gas is a lot more expensive than my gas, but you also create gas. You're good at creating gas yourself. You're a good gas machine. That's great.
All they need to do is fit a pipeline to my face, and we could have world peace.
Well, I'll tell you one thing about you. You know what you're talking about, so it makes it much easier for me, because you do understand what's going on. My only shock is, really, to be honest, including the press in London. I must say the London Times was one of the few people that figured out the story I was writing had some relevance. But most of the cheerleading for Ukraine was madness all the way in the war. There was, I'm sorry, it doesn't mean I love Russia. I certainly don't want to admit to any fondness for anything in Russia. That would make me out to be really in trouble. I'd have to have my wife start the car for the next year, and there's so much hostility to Russia that it overrides common sense. That's what it's done. It's just overridden the notion that the Russian army is going to lose to Ukraine. It's just not going to happen. And when Biden wanted the whistle blown, blew it up, the people who in the community, we're talking about the creme de creme, were really appalled by it. They saw it as him deciding, I'm going to keep Germany and Western Europe cold and broke because I want to try and win this war in Ukraine, a war that he cannot win. The trick that I will tell you that I've learned in my long, as you said, many, many years, is presidents love wars because they're good for ratings.
Oh, Seymour.
All right, I got to go. You got to go.
No, all right.
Put your head back down.
Put the phone down.
Put it back on so I feel better.
Listen, I'm getting a bit sick of the level to which you're directing my outfit. Do you want a Pulitzer Prize for wardrobe next?
I'll see you guys.
Hey, thanks
By the way,
for joining
I'll tell you one thing I didn't know. I was a lot of people ask me why Substack. Substack is I'm my own producer there. It's an amazing place. In other words, there was more than 1 million hits on that story within less than a day, and I get all these emails from people saying, "Wow, here comes somebody really telling a story now," and they're onto the media. They are onto the media. They're onto the idea that there's either one side or the other. There's no middle, and that means there's no good reporting. And so it's fascinating. I think the economics of the newspaper business are going to change enormously in the next decade.
Yeah.
My last one. Goodbye. I got to go to work.
You're all right.
This isn't work.
No, you can't call this work, coming on being vaguely offensive, making some gas jokes.
We could, you know, the only thing missing is the pub and the beer. Goodbye. Talk to you.
God bless you, Seymour Hersh. Thank you so much. You can find Seymour's incredible work at seymourhersh.substack.com, where as well as providing investigative journalism, cruel barbs come for free. What I thought was that had basically the dynamic of the film Up, and we were talking about balloons. You know, there's that curmudgeonly old man, and that little boy is called Russell in the film Up, who's sort of like a little bit optimistic and stuff. I'm optimistic.
What about, like, he's obviously so brilliant, Seymour Hersh, and like even in the Times when he was talking about all the Times, because they were the only newspaper that kind of published it, the mainstream newspaper in this country, and even in that they were like, the veteran reporter, now aged 82, like really trying to do him for like being he's so brilliant.
I feel like we've lost the basic and positive aspects of tribe and hierarchy, i.e. that person is an elder.
Yes.
So when you're talking to that person, you think, oh, well, I'm dealing with someone that I would speak respectfully to, like I would if it was in a family or community environment. When everything becomes this sort of mindless damning of patriarchy, even though there are doubtless corrupt things that have come from authoritative and power-oriented structures, doesn't mean that you lose regard for wisdom. That's how people move forward, is by like, all right, take on board what this dude's saying, then we'll apply it to what we've learned and what people younger than us are observing about the cultural trends and priorities of their generation. There needs to be some cohesion. Every direction we have, I think, like a kind of deracination and separation, that we're not connecting to one another in good faith and in love. There's so much antipathy that in the end, to maintain their line, they have to start dismissing people that are clearly plausible, credible, and in the case of Seymour Hersh, I would argue, quite brilliant. And it's also like, that's the, like he was taking a piss of it, wasn't he? And he was sort of like, but he was having a laugh. It was sort of that sounding